Church of God, a family of believers, disciples of the Lord, united in one spirit, ignited by the fire, still burning through the ages, still present in our lives. Church of God, a family of believers, disciples of the Lord, united in one spirit, ignited by the fire, still burning through the ages, still present in our lives. O Comforter, to thee we cry, thou gift of God sent from on high, thou fount of life and fire of love, the
day talking about incliners. Hi, Dick. Good. I've had two, yes. That's the one thing about being part of a community. I'm in a program called Elder One. It's a managed care program. Is that right, Kathy? That's how you say it? A managed care program, and they got the shots. And so I'm not at the mother house, but I live so close. I got there in 5 minutes because they had extras. So I got shot. I probably need it. How are you? Pardon me? I hope, yeah. Yeah, I am. Once in a while, I have my back gives me trouble from the fall, so I just sit down and it goes away. Hi, sweet tooth. Good, and you? Thank you. Your daughter-in-law keeps her eye on me. Good morning, sir. Keeps her eye on me. It can be. Years ago, she said to me, I can't wait to get my hands on you if you ever come to the mother house. But she knows her stuff. Their daughter-in-law is a nurse. She did, and she'll sometimes Zoom, well, what do you call it? FaceTime. Hi, Rich. FaceTime, and she'll ask me questions, you know. And I usually tell the truth. Pardon me? Well, yeah, make it up. Hi, Sue. Hi, Fran. How are you? It's good to see you, honey. Belated happy birthday. Yeah, good. Good to see you, honey. Take care of yourself. Good morning. Good to see you. Morning, Joan. Good. There you go. Bob, how are the boys? Good. I wish it was. No, I'm in a First Communion white. Oh yeah, I love red. Yeah. Listen, got to keep up. Look at that sweater. That's pretty nice.
You know, I think it's a good day because our bird feeder has like seven families of cardinals.
Get out of town.
Backyard every day.
Oh, I love them.
Oh, they're so pretty against the white snow.
And it's sitting, tell him it's right on the peninsula in my kitchen. Right, everybody sees it when they come in.
Yeah, and they rain.
And I tell the truth where it's from. That's right. Well, are you ready? set, go. Well, I want to welcome you back. You're good to do it, to come, and thank you. I want to continue our reading from Isaiah. Remember, we called him, at least some Christian scholars say he wrote the fifth gospel because he's quoted so much. I'm quoting now from a section that is called The Suffering Servant. It's a continuation of the reading from last week. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we counted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. Upon him the punishment that made us whole. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, but the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet did not open his mouth. Like a lamb he was led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent. By perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Can't you see how the early church saw that as a representation of Jesus? That whole suffering servant section, I was reading in a book by Amy Jill Levine and another scholar, and some of it is too much for me to even get to, but they talk about this section in the book of Isaiah, the suffering servants. And they basically say Isaiah could have meant many things. The suffering servant could have been the nation. And we know nations suffer. It could have been an individual they were hoping for, whatever. But for the early church, most of whom at that point were Jewish, they looked back and saw that, and they have applied it, and we hear it in our scriptures as a reference to Jesus. Okay. So, again, good morning, and thank you for returning. Last week, you and I spent some time on the historical aspects of the passion and death of Jesus. The who, what, and how. Is there anyone who wants to ask something or a comment that you've thought about during the week after we separated? Any question? Ooh, okay. Well, today, we want to look at the why of the story. There are, and in addition to the why, we're going to look at some of the similarities and differences among the gospel writers. That's our task today. And next week, we'll concentrate on Mark. So the why of the story. You and I know that throughout history, men and women have been so convinced of their call, their purpose in life, and their views that they were willing to lay down their lives for those views and issues. Many before the coming of Jesus and many after. So let me just ask you, does a particular name come to your mind of someone who was willing to go that far for what they truly believed to be the truth? And they paid a terrible price. Can you think of anyone? Rich? Okay. All right, there's one before Christ who was willing to give up the dearest thing in his life for his faith, Abraham. Sue said, isn't it interesting that Rich mentioned Abraham, because today, yesterday and today, the Pope is in Iraq visiting the believed to be place of Abraham's birth, and held a joint meeting with Sunni Muslims, Christians, invited the Jewish community, but they didn't come. They're very small. But Abraham is considered the father of those three huge denominations. Thanks for that. Any other person?
Wasn't there a saint at the time of Henry VIII who would not give, his name was not coming?
I got it for you, though. Yvonne said, wasn't there someone at the time of Henry VIII? It was Thomas More. And he could not sign that statement that Henry was head of the church, and he was beheaded. Yes. Oscar Romero, he was the Archbishop in Salvador, and he came into office as quite a conservative, but as he dealt with the people, he gradually shifted his ideas and began to speak out against the oppression of the poor. He was celebrating the Eucharist when someone in the back of the church shot him. Joan of Arc, the people in that period of time who were considered heretics, not burned at the stake. Think about that. The Inquisition. Think about that. Because you don't agree with our interpretation of God's law, that's it for you. Yes. That's right, Maximilian Kolbe, a priest who went to death so that someone else could live in the Holocaust. Pardon me? Yes. There was dead. I think I know, I can't tell you the name. A man who refused to take an oath to support the Nazi regime. Yeah. When I was putting this together, I thought of the numbers of people that died during the Protestant Reformation. The 30 Years' War. Think about that. Both men and women, Catholics and Reformers, died in that. Yvonne?
Going with that, in a way, my grandfather was rejected by his family to be a Protestant, married a Catholic.
Yeah. Well, that was an emotional death, wasn't it? And so many of us know stories of people who stepped outside the family prescriptions and married someone, even within their own faith, but a different culture, Italian and Irish, oh my. Lutheran and Catholic, oh my. Right? Yeah. A Jewish, yep. And think of the young people today, gay and lesbian, often killed. Remember Matthew Shepard? People who lay down their lives or it's taken from them. Scientists who were put to death. I'm thinking recently of Martin Luther King Jr. and some of the civil rights people. John Lewis was almost killed coming over the bridge, which we celebrate very shortly. I'm thinking of the 4 church women in El Salvador, raped and murdered because they went back to minister. I'm thinking of the man who's in prison right now in Russia, Navalny. The courage to go back after he was poisoned, knowing that he might lay down his life for his people. When the women in El Salvador were killed, so were a whole batch of Jesuits and their housekeeper and her daughter. I think of the Chinese in Tiananmen Square. I think of the people in Hong Kong holding on to the independence that they were promised. I think of the Muslims living in China who are oppressed. I think of the people who marched for George Floyd. I think of the Capitol Police doing their duty, some of whom died or took their lives. And so throughout history, there have been people who have been willing to take that step, the step that Jesus took, to lay down their life for a belief and a cause, something they felt God called them to. Now, I've mentioned a book, an author by the name of Amy Jill Levine, and Rob asked me if I'd make a list of those books, and I will. I'll put them all together for you. She has a book. Here she is. It's entitled Entering the Passion of Jesus, A Beginner's Guide to Holy Week. And the thing that's so interesting about this book is that Amy Jill Levine is a conservative Jew. That should stop you right there. She is a professor of New Testament at Vanderbilt University, Divinity School. Amy Jill Levine. And she writes this in the introduction to her book, and I think it's interesting. What can a Jewish person teach you about the Gospels? I would not spend my life studying the New Testament if I did not think the subject worthwhile and even inspirational. Although I do not worship Jesus, I find much of his message of the kingdom of heaven compelling. In the numerous church-based programs I have done, almost unfailingly, someone says to me, AJ, you've read the New Testament numerous times. It's clear you have a deep appreciation for the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. Why aren't you a Christian? It's a fair question. Here's how I respond. Belief or faith is not a matter of logic or academic ability. It is a matter of grace, and so a matter of calling, of vocation. I'm personally completely fulfilled in my own tradition, and yet I see the beauty and the wonder of the gospel story. I can, as a historian, guide my students to read more closely, to find more meaning, and to appreciate more deeply this magnificent text. And I, as a Jew, can see so much profound teaching in these pages. If I can, surely my Christian friends can find even more. I do not seek to challenge Christian theological claims. Instead, I seek through my study and my teachings to enhance them. Isn't that impressive? So with those little thoughts as a sort of a foundation, let's ask the question, why are we here today celebrating this Holy Week? Why did it happen? We know the who, the what, the where, the when. What about the why? What do you think? All right. Now there's one Go ahead, I'm sorry. Oh, all right, honey. I guess I'm not. There's one theory that Jesus died to open up the gates of heaven, which presumes they were closed. Doesn't it? Okay, so that's one theory. Well, I think it is linked with another theory that his death was an atonement. That's a big one, atonement, reparation, because our first parents ate the apple, were driven from the garden, and so the interpretation was they and their descendants all bear original sin. And therefore, there is that block that only a divine one can make reparations to a divine God for that original sin. Now, many people don't understand original sin that way anymore. You can, that's perfectly okay. But many people say, well, all of you who are parents and grandparents who have held that baby in your eyes is not a sinner. That baby is God's beloved gift, but the baby is human. So people like Matthew Fox refer to all of us as not coming with original sin, but with original blessing. But we're finite, and we do sin. But original sin, atonement, that's one big theory for why this week happened in the minds of some. What's another theory? Well, let me lay one out there. The other theory was fear. Fear. Why? Fear of what? This links with last week. Yes. Fear of death. Let me lay one other one on you. Fear of Rome. Fear of Rome. Because the religious leaders really wanted Jesus arrested. Why? Because they wanted to keep the playing field level. They didn't want to disrupt the Romans for fear they would exercise more control and violence over the people. Fear was in the minds of some. Pardon me, love? For them, it was practical. So, for example, remember we mentioned last week, who appointed the high priests in the temple? Rome made the selection. So, in other words, there's another practical thing, and I put down here, he, for some, was an assault on their tradition. Because remember, Jesus said, I didn't come to destroy the law, I came to fulfill it. In other words, I'd like you to go underneath and look what the original meaning of the law was. In the minds of some who held power, he was an assault on their tradition. And when you have power, whether you're a religious leader or an economic leader or a political leader, once you taste it, for some people, it's very difficult to release. The English scholar once said, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So, fear, assault on tradition. Some went along with this week because they sincerely believed Jesus was a problem. They felt he had to be taken out. Some didn't want to lose power. Amy Jill Levine, in her table of contents, writes, when you're thinking about the Passion and Holy Week, she suggests you look at it from the lens of risk. That Jesus took risks that got him in trouble. He risked his reputation. He risked going in the temple with righteous anger. His teachings challenged the norms. At the dinner, when his feet were anointed, he took the risk of reaching out to people who were unacceptable. He took the risk of losing friends. And even in the garden, he risked temptation. So in her mind, this week unfolded because Jesus took risks. Pardon, love? In the minds of some, he was radical. And I think that word can get us in trouble. Because just like the word tradition can, tradition means that people in leadership, one of their roles is to hold on to the basics and the traditions of the group they're serving. That's Pope Francis's role. To hold on to the traditions, the roots that make us who we are. But you can hold on to it so tightly, you can't see ways in which it might shift. You said one other word, too. Radical. And radical, the term, for some of us, it means just going in and burning everything down. For others, radical means I'm going to the roots of how this should be, how to look at this. So a lot depends on how you execute some of these views. Like, excuse me if I sound nasty, but there is a bishop somewhere here in the United States who's advising, could you hear me? I'll get it. There's a bishop here in the United States that is advising people not to take the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because the vaccine was developed from embryonic stem cells. Pope Francis has said that's not a problem. But this bishop is, in his mind, upholding a tradition that for him, it's all about the question of abortion and death. For Francis, it's all about the question of life. So you can see how traditions can get mushed. Go back, honey. That's right. Yeah. Yep. Sue was saying she has begun to realize what a threat Jesus was, especially to people in positions of leadership, because of what he could do. He was also a threat because of those with whom he engaged. Remember, the religious leaders were saying, well, why are you eating with tax collectors and sinners? So I do think he was, in many cases, a real threat to people. So there are a variety of reasons why this week unfolded. Yes? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know, but I do know I'm not going to second guess God on that one. Maybe he'll come again. I don't know. And that's a good question. I don't know why that time. But for some, and I don't know the answer. Yep. All right. Let's take a look at the similarities around this event as expressed by the gospel writers. Now, I have a book here. I'll get curvature of the spine more than I have by bringing it. This is called a synopsis of the four Gospels. The earlier version is called the Gospel Parallels. The earlier version took Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke And the author, this book, one half is Greek, and I don't speak Greek, and one half is English. But in this book, they take the four Gospels and they line them, they take the life of Jesus and they line up what each Gospel writer said about the event. They parallel them. And if you look at this, you can see the similarities and differences between and among the Gospels. The one great similarity among the four is that they relied on oral tradition. In other words, I love the word, they were ear witnesses. They were ear witnesses. The second thing is that Raymond Brown agrees that all four Gospels agree that Jesus was subjected to Jewish legal inquiry after he was arrested. And that they all agree he went before Pilate. They all agree that a council of elders called the Sanhedrin were involved at some point in Jesus' death. Council of elders were the religious leaders. You see, what we have is a theocracy. The Jews were living under religious law. And they were trying to balance their power with the power of Rome. All four gospel writers agree on the crucifixion. Each writer conveyed the facts he had, but none were there as eyewitnesses. Each writer was conveying his interpretation of the story to a particular community. It's like Rob is telling St. Catherine's what this is going to be like when they're in partnership with Transfiguration. And Mike Bausch is telling Transfiguration what it's going to be like when they're in partnership with St. Catherine's. Two different communities, two different cultures. They all drew on the Old Testament, which makes sense because they were all Jewish. And they all were writing to different communities with different needs and different styles and different cultures. There's an agreement, Raymond Brown tells us, that the writers of the four Gospels were trying to do three things. They were trying to show how they thought Jesus understood his own death. What did Jesus think about his death? Secondly, they were trying to tell how the communities to whom they were writing understood the death. And thirdly, how did the gospel writer understand Jesus' death? So can you see in those purposes how there will be differences? Okay. Now, last week someone asked about and that might be a fun future lecture sometime, about the non-canonical Gospels. It would be interesting. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945, there is no reference to the death of Jesus in it. Isn't that interesting? The Gospel of Mary, which dates even earlier, no reference to his death, just his departure. Isn't that interesting? And the Gospel of Judas, which was discovered, known about, it's very interesting that Judas, in the Gospel of Judas, does not come off as a villain, but a hero, who in a sense saved Jesus from himself. It's just fascinating to look at the varieties. So there were many things that they held in common, but the differences are the things that make us wonder, because we think it's all written as a biography or history. So let me talk a little bit about differences, okay? This is personal. My sister died, it'll be 2 years in October. Now, none of us could deny that it happened. All of us, except the grandchildren, were there when they came and took her to the funeral parlor. You can't deny the death. But each one of us, her husband, her 3 children, her 5 grandchildren, me, the in-laws, friends, and neighbors all saw that death in different ways and from their own vantage point. Does that make sense? Okay. There was a different experience for each one of us. How her spouse felt after 60-some years is different than how her 12-year-old grandchild felt. I, who knew her the longest, had a different reaction than a neighbor. And our memories differed. For example, she was 3.5 years older than I, and we remembered our parents in different ways, and will tell stories to their grandchildren about our parents and their different stories. So the question is, which one is true? All of them. All of them are true. So that gives us a model for all of the Gospels are true because the authors took what they heard, the oral stories, and presented them. True from their experience. What I experienced about my sister was very different from what her husband did. But it doesn't make my experience less true than his. Haven't you had that experience in your family, especially when someone has died? We see it differently. Yeah. So I think that's a great model for us to look at when we look at the differences of the why. The Gospels differ in length, they differ in context, they differ in dates. So let's look at the first one, Mark. And next week, Mark will get a real thorough look. But I think it's interesting. Many scholars think Mark was an interpreter of Peter. Now that gets us closer to the original. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what some scholars think. They think the gospel was written from Rome, seat of power, in the 60s. Remember what we learned last week about Nero in 64, the burning of Rome? Who did he blame it on? Christians. Perhaps Peter was a source of information. That's a belief. Peter and Paul died in Rome in the 60s. They were long gone before Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, not Mark, wrote their Gospels. And when Mark wrote his Gospel, he emphasized the first half with Jesus' work in the northern country, Galilee, the second half in Jerusalem. And why did Mark write his Gospel? To deepen and strengthen the faith of Christians. Why? Because they were being persecuted. The Roman emperors, really, the Colosseum was a great place to get rid of them with a few little lions. Mark's gospel is closest to the event 30-some years after the resurrection. But 30 years, lifespan then wasn't long. He was closest. So we'll put Mark to the side for 1 week, because next week he's going to be the center of attention. Now Matthew, he bore the name of an apostle. We don't know if he was the apostle. I doubt it. But Matthew drew on the stories of Mark. Matthew and Luke drew on Mark, and you see in the gospel parallels, they repeat each other. And there's another source that Matthew and Luke drew on. It was called Q. It's a German, I can't tell you the German name, they just call it Q, oral stories that were floating around. We could call the oral stories that floated around about my mother. And we pull them forth and use them at family gatherings. Mark was a source for Matthew, and so was Q and other oral traditions. Now, Matthew is writing for a Jewish community driven out of Jerusalem. Think of the choices that those early Jews made. It's like marrying someone from another faith. It's like gay kids today thinking their parents will throw them out and they never can come home. We all know those stories. Think of what that was like for a Jewish person to say, I'm a faithful Jew, but Jesus has given me an interpretation of my tradition that I believe. Think of the conflict in families. What? You went through your bar mitzvah? We have spent our life training you in the faith, and you're going to walk away to someone who's looking at it with different lenses. Think of the conflict. And what I'm saying is there was sincerity on both sides and pain on both sides. Do you remember when Spiritus Christi started from Corpus Christi? Think of the pain in our diocese when that happened. Families were divided. Think of the pain Matthew went through. And people were sincere on both sides, and both communities remain, but that process was full of agony. And I think that's similar to what happened to some of the Jews as they decided they were going to follow Jesus. Jesus, Matthew is stating, he's writing to a Jewish community, Jesus was not going to destroy the law, but fulfill it. But for some Jews, that didn't work. And so his outlook was predominantly to Jewish Christians, maybe between 70 and 80. Now you see he's out 40 years, 50 years. And the temple has been destroyed. The center of their faith that rocked the people, the temple was destroyed. So for Matthew, in a sense, he has a handbook for teaching and preaching. So he gives these long discourses, the Sermon on the Mount. And he's the one who uses the Old Testament at least 10 times in the gospel. Why? He's writing to Jews. For him, Jesus is the Christ. Isn't that sort of fascinating, though, when you think about the community to whom he was writing? He picked things that were going to help them in that process. I think today of families. I remember Father Ray Fleming was having a birthday party. He's the pastor at St. Monica's, and he lives in Montana. And he was going home for the birthday party of a family member. And he said to me, Barb, we're going to have 2 parties at 2 different bars. I said, why? He said, one for the Democrats and one for the Republicans. It makes sense. Think about how politics destroys families. You can't even talk about some things. And I think that is a condition that Matthew was looking at. Any question about that? Does it make sense? Does it, Yvonne? Oh, good. I'll get the check for you later. Anybody else a question? Matthew. Kathy, are you thinking? Yes, you're thinking, I know, okay. Now let's take a look at the next gospel. Phil and I were talking before we started that when you look up things, if you go on Google and you look up, well, when was Luke written? Everybody disagrees. So they say something like, well, between 70 and 80. I understand that. I mean, the histories weren't being written. But Matthew and Luke, probably around the same time. Like Matthew, Luke drew from Mark. So when you look at the parallels, you see those three. That's why they're called synoptic. Matthew, Mark, Luke, very similar. They plagiarized Mark. And also Luke made use of that oral tradition Q, written from Antioch. But the interesting thing is, Luke is writing for a very different audience, primarily Gentile. So, by the time both Matthew and Luke wrote, the temple was gone. We have to get in our heads what it was like when the early church was faced with the question, shall we admit non-Jews? What am I going to do if my daughter, who is 100% Italian, is going to marry a 100% Irishman? How are we going to bring him into the family, into the culture, the foods, and so forth? Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Rich was saying, during this time when Luke was writing, the early church fathers got together and came up with an answer to the question. But it is, I think, just fascinating how we accept people. How are we going to accept the gays and lesbians in our community? How has our church accepted divorce? You know, they raise big questions. Oh, I'm going to hold it. And to try to solve the problem, the Council of Jerusalem came into play, and they decided that the new Christians did not have to be circumcised. That is, you don't have to become a Jew to become a Christian. Now imagine if they had said, yes, you have to become a Jew to become a Christian. What would that have done? What would the effect of that have been? It could, that's right, Bob said it would shrink. It could limit the people that wanted to come in. What if they said, you can be a Christian if you obey all the Jewish laws? You see what you'll have then? A two-tiered system. First-class Jews, second-class Gentiles. And the Council of Jerusalem said, we're not going to do that. I'll try this again. It must be my beautiful ears that won't hold it. But it is, that was a huge decision. Huge. And then the question is, how are we going to live together once you're in? How are you going to live together? The other thing about Luke's gospel is that he portrays Jesus as someone who really hung around with outcasts. And women played a much larger role. And for him, Jesus was rejected because people thought he was a prophet. Okay? The Acts of the Apostles was volume 2 of Luke, and half of it deals with Peter and half with Paul. Now to John, the fourth gospel. This is an interesting fact that Paul's epistles were written before John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Paul is the earliest of the Christian writers. The earliest. We're not sure which John wrote this gospel, but now we're almost to 100. We're almost to the end of the first century. And John writes very differently. He writes in metaphor. He uses signs. It's much more reflective. You remember the story at the Last Supper, a long discourse on the vine and the branches, and I have come to be served, a much more reflective gospel. No account of the birth, just in the beginning was the Word, a beautiful poem reflective of Genesis. Now let me give you a couple more differences, and then we'll get into a hot discussion, I hope. Only Matthew records the 30 pieces of silver. Isn't that interesting? Only Matthew. Only Matthew records the death of Judas. The Acts of the Apostles speaks of Judas' death and replacement, and only Matthew speaks of Pilate's wife coming out, asking him to reconsider. And only Matthew talks about the blood be upon us and our children. And only Matthew has guards at the tomb. Don't you wonder why? Only Luke speaks of Jesus turning and looking at Peter after the denial. Only Luke. They all say he denied, but only Luke has Jesus turn and look at him. Only Luke speaks of the women along the way, daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me. And only Luke has the repentant man on the cross. But you see, Luke's gospel was reaching a broader audience. Only John records the explicit language about the Eucharist. But you see, by the time John was writing, the Eucharist was being celebrated in homes. Only John has the long discourse on the vine and the washing of the feet and the use of gardens. Only John is the one that has Jesus continually identify himself, I am the resurrection and the life, the way, the truth, and the life. I am he, when they said, where is Jesus? I am the bread of heaven. I am the good shepherd. Only Luke has Jesus' side pierced. Only Luke has the dialogue about his mother at the cross. John does not speak of Simon of Cyrene. And only John tells about Peter's violence, cutting off the ear. So, there are differences and there are similarities. What does this all say to us? Pardon me? They were human and they saw things differently. They were concerned about the community that they served and to whom they were sending their gospel. The important thing to remember about this week, this season and this week, that the agreements are the key. What they agreed upon and what the early church agreed upon, that's the key. Remember the span of time. Remember that oral stories were circulating. Remember the communities had different needs. And I think for those of you who have children, you understand this because you understand the needs of your children. They are different one from the other, and your grandchildren, and you respond to them according to their need. And that's what the gospel writers were doing. Bob. It was mostly the early church, it was oral. and preaching. And then gradually, in the monastic area, the copies were begun to be made.
But the early church, they relied on
Oral,
me telling
that's right,
and most people,
telling,
so you can see where
yeah.
it could be few.
You could see, but if you can see where there would be differences, but the major things remain the same. Oh, yeah. That's why it's important to concentrate on what we agree upon. When he was born, what he did, how he was received, his family, we talked about that in Advent, how he got in trouble, why he was arrested, and there are a variety of reasons, that he was crucified, and that something happened on Easter Sunday that changed the world. And so the responsibility of his followers was to transmit this fundamental message to people who heard and were interested. Any other question? Well, he was written in the end of the first century. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of years to be passed down. Yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing. We're not sure which John it is. And it's, you know what, the other thing is, if you would prefer to think it's John, the beloved apostle, that's right, age-wise is a factor. A lot of them were gone. And you see, the problem for the early church, we think we have problems today, as the apostles die away, those who had the immediate contact, the question for them is, how can we be faithful and pass this on? That is important. It was passed on, and unless I didn't hear, he wrote it down. He wrote down the oral stories, and those oral stories, they were passed on and on. Yeah, yeah. Primary source as we understand it today. Because for them, Jesus was the primary source. And then the oral stories. But it's not like what you and I went to write a paper or a dissertation. That kind of stuff. Once the printing press was invented, prior to that, the monks were copying. And monks made mistakes in the copying. But the printing press, once we got the printing press, what was then on paper, and now we go through different translations. I was saying to somebody, and I'll come right to you, sir, I was saying to somebody, I wish I had taken Hebrew or Greek, because then you could see what the words actually meant when they were originally written, because we've translated them as best we could into our vernacular. But that's why I like the New Revised Standard, because it's a pretty accurate translation. Yeah. Yes, sir. That's right. right, right. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. That's right. Jesus spoke Aramaic. Then we have some Hebrew writing, but the Greek is the one that was finally translated into Greek. And but the language makes a huge difference. Makes a huge difference. So you see, they overcame enormous problems when you think about it to get these stories out. But the critical thing is, what did they have in common? His birth, his ministry, which was recognized by non-Jews. He got himself into trouble, or people got him into trouble. Some in his own community did not accept him. Rome decided capital punishment. And something happened 3 days later that changed the world. So, what do you think? Oh, I spelled it out. I spelled it out. Oh, and it's almost 11. So, I hope this helps you. I think it's always a struggle in history for us. For example, for those of us that are Roman Catholic, it's been a struggle for some people to accept Vatican II. We have to be honest about that. It has been. Because they saw some traditions shifting. And the purpose of the shift was because the community is shifting. And people wanted to hear the Eucharist in their language. So, but it's been hard for some people. So you can imagine how the growth of the church went through enormous struggles as they tried to make this particular gospel take on life. Some people say, and this will be my last comment, but some people say how wonderful it was when Constantine made the church the official religion of Rome. Some people say it was unfortunate. It was fortunate because it stopped the persecution and the death. But it eventually put the church in a position where it gained so much power that it did harm in some ways. Always two sides to every story. Okay? Next week, Mark, and the last week, we come right up to the present time. My question is, so what? And I want to thank you so much for coming and making the effort. I appreciate it. Okay. What else is new, Sue? Good.
And one of the things that impressed me so much, after this priest died, his soldiers made a cross and made of the body of Jesus on the cross, and to make the crown of thorns around his head, they used the wires from their radio. It's just, and this priest, by the way, I can't remember his name, he did receive the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously from President Obama, but I think the progression is being made.
In the church. Yeah. Those are people that the courage, I don't think I'd have it, that they lay down their life for someone. I mean, that's courage. I'd tell everything and run. know, I'd be so scared. All right, Kathy Powers. Yeah. Yeah. What's the author? Yeah. Joe Pape, P-A-P-E. Pape. All right, dears, be safe, go home. Stop anywhere you want.